You are listening to Meet the Thriller Author, the podcast where I interview writers of mysteries, thrillers, and suspense books. I am your host, Alan Peterson, and this is episode number 136. In this episode of the podcast, we'll be meeting Dana Stabenow, who is an author of science fiction, mystery, crime fiction, suspense and thrillers, and historical adventure novels. Her latest book, Spoils of the Dead, was just released. It's the fifth book in the Liam Campbell series, which is set in her home state of Alaska. Before we get to the interview, though, make sure to visit thrillingreads.com/links to access the links to be able to check out the show notes for this episode, as well as links to rate and review this podcast over at Apple Podcasts, and where you can join my Thrilling Reads mailing list to access amazing deals on best-selling thriller and mystery books. That's thrillingreads.com/links. All right, now on to my interview with Dana Stabenow. Hi, everybody. This is Alan with Meet the Thriller Author, and I'm excited to have Dana Stabenow. I'm sorry. How do you pronounce your last name?
It's Stabenow, but don't worry, nobody ever gets it right.
I should have asked you that before. Dana is an Edgar Award-winning and New York Times bestselling author of crime fiction and thriller books, and her latest novel, Spoils of the Dead, will be published on February 4th. Really excited to have Dana here on the podcast. Welcome.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here and to see you.
Yes, the new way, right? The new Zoom way.
Yeah.
So can you tell us a little bit about your background and your journey that led you to becoming an author?
I feel like I've told this story 9 million times. Sorry, you caught me a little flat-footed. I was born in Alaska. I've lived there all my life. It seems natural to me to write about it. And of course, it's a big place. So I move my characters all over it, exploiting every bit of it that I possibly can. Probably the reason that I write crime fiction is because I was raised in a really small town called Stabenow. It's across the bay from where I live now. There's no road to it. You have to fly or you have to take a boat. And we didn't have our own police. So when there was trouble in the town, we'd have to call the Alaska State Troopers to come in. At that point, they were stationed in Ninilchik. And, in a small town where there's only like 300 or 400 people, there's not a lot to do. So when you hear that the Alaska State Troopers come to town, naturally, all the kids go out to the airport to see him land in his plane and climb out. So that's what we did. And I remember one time something pretty bad happened in the town and the trooper came, and I remember him getting out of that plane and getting out of that plane and getting out of that plane. He was a very tall man and, dressed in the very wonderful state trooper uniform with the smoky hat. And I think at that moment, I didn't know it at that time, but I think at that moment I was going to start writing crime fiction at some point in my life.
Well, were you a fan of the genre, reading it before
Honestly,
then, or no?
No. I'm sorry to say no. I didn't read crime fiction for years. My mother read a lot of crime fiction, and she kept trying to get me into it. And I think probably just in that perverse way that kids have. No, I'm not going to do it because my mom does it. I think I was in my early 20s before she managed to finally force me to read The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tey, in which Josephine Tey breaks all of the crime fiction conventions, and which I didn't know until I'd read a lot more in the genre later in my life. And then, of course, there was no looking back. I didn't read anything but for a long time.
And how long did it take you? What was the driving force that led you to try to write your own book?
Well, I mostly, you want me to tell the truth, I suppose. Mostly, basically, I was just having a good time in my 20s. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was being built, and everybody my age wanted to go see what was going on. So I got a job on the pipeline, and that led to a job on the slope in the oil fields. And then I got to a point where I thought, okay, it's time to fish or cut bait. I had an undergraduate degree in journalism. So what do I want to do? I'd be a journalist. For one thing, it didn't pay. And crime fiction was going to pay anymore. And I thought, well, okay. So I went back to school, I got my master's degree. And my goal was that I was going to publish a novel before I ran out of my savings. And I just barely made it. Oh, wow. And it wasn't crime fiction. It was science fiction. I didn't write my first crime fiction novel, the first Kate Shugak novel. I didn't publish until after I'd published 2 fiction novels.
Oh wow! And what was your first book that was published? Then it was a science fiction. Was the first one?
Yeah, it's called Second Star.
Oh.
It's about it's about colonizing low Earth orbit.
Oh. And so for those for listeners who aren't familiar with your work, can you describe your writing style, your books, your crime fiction, your thriller books to us?
I have said to friends of mine, don't put up a tombstone for me after I die. But if you do, this is what I want on it. She wrote with vigor.
Like it.
I like You Are There books. I like books that I can like climb into like a time machine or a traveling machine that will transport me to that world. And that is exactly the way I try to write. Somebody once told me in a not very approving tone that I certainly included a lot of detail in my books. And I thought, well, yeah, that's what I like to read. So that's what I write.
And how many books do you have published so far?
Oh, man, I think it's about 37.
Oh, wow. That's awesome. So can you tell us about your latest book, Spoils of the Dead? What's it about?
Spoils of the Dead is a return to characters that were last published, I think it's 16 years ago now. And I can't really write a book until I come up with a halfway decent plot. And so I had stumbled across this book about an archaeological find. And I thought, what could I use that for in the way of creating a plot? And of course, immediately I thought of when I was working for the oil companies, for BP. And I thought about all the environmentalists that they had up there on staff and how they weren't much in the way of environmentalists. They were there basically just to sign off on everything that the oil companies did. And I thought to myself, well, wouldn't it be fun if there was an archaeologist that a natural resource extraction company would, hire to do the same thing? And it took off from there. And then I wanted to relocate these. It's standard operating procedure for Alaska State Troopers to move around the state. They don't have they don't stay in the same place all the time. They move them around. And Liam, had the state trooper character featured in Spoils of the Dead, had been in Newenham, the fictional town of Newenham, for years. And I thought, okay, move him. There's other personal stuff going on in their lives that help move him as well. But that was the main thing. I wanted to move him.
What was it like to revisiting characters that you hadn't worked for 16 years? Or
Well, the first thing I had to do was go back and skim through all the books to remember what he was doing. And, all the characters. But because it took a lot longer to write than I remembered to begin a series because, and I've learned stuff now, it isn't like, I'm brand new to the game anymore. I know there are certain things that you have to tick off on the list. And for one, have to create, the most important thing is that you have to create some kind of a decent supporting cast. A supporting cast in a book, it's not the main character. I have never believed. It's certainly not only the main character that sells a book to a reader. It is the supporting cast. The supporting cast gets a backstory. Every member of the supporting cast gets a backstory. I don't care if it's one line or if it's a subplot that runs the entire line of the book. You have to have that supporting cast in place. Well, they just don't miraculously appear. So it took a lot more work than I thought it was going to. And then, of course, I have to describe the setting, which is also very important to me, because I think once you understand your setting, then you know who lives there and you can figure out what to get up to.
Yeah, and Alaska is such a big part of your book. So it's kind of like reading a Michael Connelly in L.A., the Harry Bosch. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. The setting is, Alaska, in the Alaska books, the setting, Alaska is probably one of the main characters. I'm not even probably. Alaska is one of the main characters of all the books set in Alaska.
Yeah, it's like the last Western frontier kind of. Like I've never been there yet, but I got to come on up after the pandemic. I have to go up there.
Yeah, not right away, but come up when you can.
Yeah. And speaking of the pandemic, how has that affected your writing, the process or anything?
It's been sort of a seesaw. At first I thought to myself, well, I work at home. I'm self-employed. I'm actually still getting paid for my work because all people have to do is go to Amazon and download a Kindle, or order it up from a good bookstore that ships. And I thought, this was a pandemic for me, I thought, in my arrogance. Well, it turns out that I need people just as much as everybody else does. And along about May, when the real serious lockdown started, it was so hard. I was extreme, one word at a time, even more slowly than I think I ordinarily do. It took a lot longer to write a page or a chapter and to finish this book. I was surprised. The only thing that I can compare it to is I felt, in some respects, a lot like the way I felt after 9/11. It was also a very difficult time to write because, hey, I'm not inventing a cure for cancer here. It's kind of hard when all of this horribleness is going on around you to convince yourself that you're doing something good in the world by just writing a book.
Yeah, it is hard on the second. I talked to a lot of people, a lot of writers, and they've all experienced that too. So it's kind of interesting. But yeah, hard not to affect us. What is what are you working on now? Are you continuing on this series? Or you have a new series coming on? What's next up for you?
I'm working on a book called, I'm writing a historical series that is set in Alexandria in the time of Cleopatra. It features the Eye of Isis, which is the Queen Cleopatra's private investigator / enforcer. And I've already written the first book in the series. I think it came out 2 years ago, but don't hold my feet to the fire on that. It's called Death and I. And I'm working on the second one now. I'm very close to finishing the second one now. It's called Disappearance of a Scribe.
Oh wow! And what's is the research process? Is your process to writing a thriller versus a historical? Is it a lot different? Is it a lot more work required?
Well, if I set a book in Alaska, I still have to do research, but I will admit that the research has increased to an order of magnitude when you're writing a book that's 1,000 years in the past, halfway around the world.
Yeah.
I did manage to squeak in a trip to Egypt just before the pandemic hit last December. And I mean, you talk about cutting it short.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But for the rest, it's been all books. It's been, you should see my research shelf. Oh my God. Shelves, plural.
And what's your writing process like then? Do you when you actually do your research, do you have to outline your books, or are you like a seat of the pants type of writer?
Mostly, I fell into the habit of writing outlines because I used to be contractually required by my publisher to provide an outline, and they would pay X amount of dollars when you submitted that outline and they approved it. And basically, it's just economic security for them. They want to see if you're actually going to, they want to take a look that they're actually going to write you a check for.
Yeah.
So I kind of got in the habit of it, but I don't outline extensively as say somebody like Jeffrey Deaver, who I heard once say writes 80-page outlines. Generally what I do, I'll guess that there'll be 15 or 20 chapters in a book, and then I'll write a paragraph per chapter saying what happens in each of those chapters. Now, that is not to say that I follow the outline slavishly, because I almost never do. Something really happens 1/3 to 2/3 of the way through the book where it's like, oh, all is revealed. And then the story pretty much takes off on its own. Yeah. And the sooner that happens, the better.
Yeah, that's what I always figured. They say, if I have too outlined, it takes away from the fun. Well, it's not like it's etched in stone. It could still grow and change as you write. You have
to allow your characters room.
Yeah.
If you're really lucky and your characters take off, they start living their own lives, and basically you're just scrambling to keep up. That is, in my opinion, the preferred outcome.
And what do you use? I always ask this question. What do you use to write? Is it like Microsoft Word or something?
Pages on. I drive a Mac. So.
Oh yeah, Pages. Yeah. Oh cool. Okay, you're the first one that's usually it's a Word or some other software.
It's really cool.
He's like, throwing me off.
Except Nobody else uses Pages, it seems like, except for me. So whenever I submit it, I have to export it to a Word doc to send it on.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Yeah, I'm on a Mac too, and recently now they changed to you don't have the Word anymore. It doesn't work with whatever version I am now. This Big Sur. So now I've been using Pages now for the last few months. So I like it, but
I like it too.
Yeah.
I like it better in Word.
Yeah.
Bill Gates.
And so then when you get the edits back as a Word doc, then you bring it back into Pages?
Generally, it comes as a PDF.
Oh, okay.
The edit comes back as the PDF, and I don't have to explain that to you. I'm sure.
Yeah. Interesting.
That I do that. The editing comes PDF, and the page proofs come as PDF. And once I got used to it, I have to say I love it. I mean, I can't even remember how much money I used to have to spend on printing out stuff and mailing it in for the postage. It was God. I spent a lot of money on that, and it's great not to do that now.
Yeah, I can imagine, especially like setting out this querying, and you had to pay for this postage back, and that was crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would have said you were too young to know that.
Yeah, well, I've read. Yeah, and so what do you still find time to read? You still enjoy reading crime fiction and thrillers, or are you too busy?
Reading has always been my primary recreational activity.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm reading. I have a book going through. Not all. I don't only read crime fiction. I pretty much read everything. I read a lot of nonfiction, partly because I love history, and also partly because you never know where you're going to find something you want to write about.
And are you going to continue on with the Liam Campbell series eventually? Or?
Honestly, it depends on how well this one sells. I don't know that my publisher will want to continue it. I hope so. I do have some more stories to tell in that series, but we'll see. I'm sorry to be so hard-nosed about it, but it's how I make my living. So.
Yeah. That's the working writer's world, right? I mean, it is what it is. Well, so Spoils of the Dead comes out on February 4th. So if people like the book, you better go out and get it. So the publisher order some more.
Did I accidentally put you on retainer there, Alan?
Yeah, no pressure there, right?
No.
But anyway, so that comes out February 4th. And where can the listeners find out more about you? You have a website or?
Stabenow.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Really enjoyed talking to you about your work and your books.
Make sure I get a link so I can post it to the Dana Maniacs page. They'll want to hear.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'll send that to you.
Okay. Thanks,
right, thank
Alan.
you. Thank you for listening to this episode of Meet the Thriller Author. For show notes and to access the interview archive, please visit my website at thrillerauthors.com. And please do visit thrillingreads.com/rate to leave a rate and review of this podcast wherever it is that you are listening to it. It's the best way to help me get the word out about the podcast to others. And finally, check out my author website at alanpeterson.com. Thank you for listening, and until next time, when I'm back with another interview on Meet the Thriller Author.